The Socialists leave the NSDAP. Dr. Otto Strasser, first published in Der Nationale Socialist, July 4, 1930. Readers, party comrades, friends. For months we have been following the development of the NSDAP with deep concern, and with growing apprehension have been forced to note how, more and more frequently and in ever more critical matters, the party has violated the idea of National Socialism. On numerous issues of foreign policy, domestic policy, and, above all, economic policy, the party adopted a position that became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the 25 points, which we viewed as the exclusive program of the party. More difficult still was the impression of the party's increasing bourgeoisification, of a precedence for tactical considerations over principles, and the alarming observation of a rapidly advancing bossification of the party apparatus, which thus became more and more an end in itself for the movement, and set its own interests higher than the programmatic demands of the idea. We conceived and still conceive of National Socialism as a consciously anti-imperialist movement, whose nationalism restricts itself to the preservation and safeguarding of the life and growth of the German nation without any tendencies towards domination over other peoples and countries. For us, therefore, the rejection of the interventionist war, prosecuted against Russia by international capitalism and by Western imperialism, was and is a natural demand, ensuing as much from our idea as from the necessities of a German foreign policy. We felt, therefore, that the attitude of the party leadership, which was becoming ever more open to interventionist war, was contradictory to the idea and detrimental to the requirements of a German foreign policy. For us, sympathy with the struggle of the Indian people for their freedom from English rule and from capitalist exploitation was and is a necessity, arising just as much from the fact that any weakening of the Versailles powers is advantageous for a German policy of liberation, as from our instinctive approval for any struggle which oppressed peoples, Völker, direct against exploitative usurpers. For it is a necessary consequence of our nationalist idea that the right of fulfillment of a Völkisch character which we claim for ourselves is also the due of all other peoples and nations, whereby the liberalistic concept of the blessings of culture is unknown to us. We felt, therefore, that the policy of the party leadership, who adopted a position of open support for British imperialism against India's liberation struggle, was as contradictory to the tangible interests of Germany as to the ideological presuppositions of National Socialism. We conceived of and still conceive of National Socialism in its entire nature as a greater German movement whose domestic mission is not least the creation of a Völkisch Greater Germany, a movement rejecting those individual states which have arisen on dynastic, religious, or arbitrary grounds, like Napoleon's interventions, and through which that unified integration of national forces essential for the liberation and self-assertion of Germany cannot be realized. We therefore felt the ever more overt stance by the party leadership in favor of the system of individual states, whose salvation and expansion of power was virtually proclaimed as a duty of National Socialism, to be equally as hostile to the interests of the nation as it was hostile to the concept of Greater German unification. We conceived and still conceive of National Socialism as a republican movement in which there is as little room for hereditary monarchy as there is for any other privilege not based upon achievement for the nation. We saw in it, and still see in it, a revolutionary movement which makes just as clean a break with an authoritarian state based on false foundations as it does with formal democracy, seeing in its state objective an organic corporate state, Ständerstaat of Germanic democracy. We therefore perceived the republican monarchist ambiguity, Halbdunkel, deliberately maintained by the party leadership as a burden, the excessive veneration for the fascist authoritarian state, as it emerged ever more strongly on the part of the official party authorities, as an absolute danger for the movement and as a sin against the idea. Above all, we maintained, and indeed still maintain, that National Socialism is the great antithesis of international capitalism, that it makes real the idea of socialism, defiled by Marxism, as the social economy of a nation acting for the benefit of that nation, that it breaks apart that system of rule by money over labor, which has inevitably prevented the development of the völkisch soul and the formation of a true Volksgemeinschaft. For us, socialism means an economy based on the real needs of the nation, the participation of the totality of producers in the ownership, management, and profits of the entire economy of this nation, that is, thus breaking the ownership monopoly of the contemporary capitalist system and, above all, breaking the management monopoly which is today tied to tenure. We therefore felt that, in contrast to the 25 points, the increasingly muddled formulation of our socialist will and the multiple mitigations made to the program's socialist demands, for example, point 17, were an offense against the spirit and program of National Socialism, when for years we have vigorously emphasized its socialist demands. Accordingly, we perceived and still perceive National Socialism to be just as hostile to the capitalist bourgeoisie as to international Marxism, and see its task as the overcoming of both, on the basis that in Marxism the inherently correct socialist sentiment is bound up with the false doctrine of the liberal mechanism and with internationalism, while among the bourgeoisie the inherently correct nationalist sentiment is bound up with the false doctrine of liberal rationalism and capitalism. And both true and essential forces in this unholy alliance can as a result bear no fruit either for nation or for history. In our opposition to Marxism and the bourgeoisie, consequently, we did not and still do not perceive any essential difference, since the liberalism working within both makes them equally our enemy. We therefore felt the leadership's increasingly one-sided rallying cry, Kampfparole, against Marxism to be a half-measure, and increasingly we were filled with the apprehension that behind it lay a sympathy for the bourgeoisie, who advocate for their own interests under the same slogan and with whom we had and have nothing in common. These fundamental apprehensions were reinforced, underscored, and highlighted through our misgivings over the tactical paths which the leadership of the NSDAP has pursued. It has always filled us with regret and uneasiness that, while Adolf Hitler frequently spoke to the leading circles of businessmen and capitalists about the aims and means of National Socialism, he never took the opportunity to do the same with leading circles of workers and peasants. The resulting impression we received, that National Socialism was closer to those former circles, thus felt to us like a severe burden, all the more so as we had to tell ourselves that the sincerity of our socialist will precludes any accommodation with those circles for whom the preservation of their capitalist rights was and is always more important than the achievement of national goals, if that achievement presupposes socialism. For the same reason, we witnessed with growing concern the close association of the leadership with Hugenberg and the German National People's Party, and to some extent also with the Stahlhelm and the so-called patriots, Vaterländischen, because all these developments, even if, as in the referendum, they could be tactically viable on a case-by-case basis, seemed appropriate only for giving a false impression of our character. As a fundamental theorem of the revolutionary character of National Socialism, we firmly stood for, and still stand for, the rejection of any form of political compromise or coalition, since every coalition always serves only to maintain the existing system as a system of national bondage and capitalist exploitation. It appears to us that, in accordance with National Socialism and in accordance with its mission, carrying out the German Revolution is simply impossible under the slogan "Into the State," which we fought against with the Stahlhelm only 2 years before, with all the force of our revolutionary will. The decision of the party leadership to form a coalition government with the bourgeois parties in Thuringia has therefore shaken us the most in our belief that the nature and mission of National Socialism as we conceive them, and as they were doubtlessly expressed within the program and in the party's past agitation, can still be sustained. Our protestations at the time were left unanswered by the leadership. Thus, the NSDAP was in the same position as the SPD after 1918, when it decided to join forces with the enemies of its economic political will and thus inevitably betrayed its political goals. With grim consequences, the same betrayal of principles took place within the NSDAP, as is evident in its approval for the poll tax, the increases in rents, etc., in Thuringia. The objection that the danger of state persecution makes such sacrifices of conviction necessary is not only incorrect, as the prohibition in Bavaria and Prussia shows, but above all, undermines the courage and character of the movement, since with this cowardly argument, every treachery can be justified. While for us all tactics derive from principles, the party leadership has for tactical reasons abandoned more and more frequently the principles of National Socialism on ever more pivotal issues. Hand in hand with the bourgeoisification of the movement went a bureaucratization, Verbonzung, that is, bossification of the party, which assumed almost frightening forms. The behavior and attitude not only of the so-called senior SA leaders, but increasingly also of the party's political functionaries, developed in a manner that was as inconsistent with the internal laws of a revolutionary movement as it was with the demands of a clean character. The direct and indirect material dependence of almost all functionaries on the party and its Führer, which, over the course of time, had become almost universal, gave rise to that atmosphere of Byzantine indignity which made the representation of any independent opinion impossible, and which had to lead to that ideational and material corruption which every party comrade witnessed with increasing bitterness without their being able to do anything to remedy the party's structural situation. The copious mistakes made in the settlement of personal disputes within the party have here their deepest underlying cause. We have observed this development within the party's fundamental, tactical, and organizational areas with growing concern, and we have been seen as its primary, most profound and unrelenting decriers and opponents at every hour over the past years. The 5 volumes of the National Sozialistische Brief bear witness to this, as does the rhetorical and personal attitude that we have taken despite the pressure and enticement from above. At no time have we, for opportunistic reasons, considered changing our stance, and often enough we were faced with the question of whether, in light of the party leadership's particularly serious violations against the essence of National Socialism, we should not speak out against it publicly. If we have not done so until now, therefore, it is because the party leadership has openly renounced the 25 points, and because we hoped that the revolutionary spirit alive within the masses of the SA, and above all within the youth, would prevail over the creeping bourgeois mentality of a bureaucratized Verbonsten, that is, bossified leadership. This hope of ours has now been rendered impossible by an act of will on the part of the party leadership. In Adolf Hitler's letter of June 30th, the Berlin Gauleiter of the NSDAP was called upon to enact a ruthless purge of the party of all Salon Bolsheviks. In conjunction with this demand, expulsion was threatened or ordered against party comrades known for being social revolutionary. Thus was the NSDAP's dissociation from the goals and demands of the German Revolution, and from the socialist points of the program openly declared by the party leadership. As upright, unyielding confessors, Bekenner, of National Socialism, as fervent fighters for the German Revolution, we reject any distortion of the revolutionary character, socialist will, and nationalist principles of National Socialism, and will henceforth remain outside of the ministerial NSDAP what we have always been, revolutionary National Socialists.